there's nothing more stressful than partnership conflicts. So do everything you can before you start your business and you sign that operating agreement to create an approach that is going to be objective. But the dynamic equity piece is something you should for sure consider and discuss with your attorney so that everything is going to be fair. And I love the idea of everyone getting compensated based on the value they've actually contributed to the business.
I can't take no loss. I don't even know what it.
I don't have a good hook to open today, Nate, even though Mr. Beast says you need to have a great hook in the first 10 seconds, otherwise you lose all your listeners. Sorry. But today we're going to talk about slicing pie, the slicing pie framework for equity. And this will get into partnerships, and we both have various experiences. Potentially some of you that are listening, you may have partnerships already. You may have broken partnerships in the past. You might be starting new companies and thinking about partnering with somebody. And when I think Mike is Mike Moyer who started the slicing pie framework. He came years ago to a mastermind that I was in and presented the framework. And I was looking at it, and I literally was thinking to myself, why the F did I not know this 3 or 4 years ago and implement this into Elevar? Because man, this would have saved a whole lot of pain, heartache, stress, anxiety, everything in between. So that is the episode. You're going to get a lot out of it if you are thinking about partners and businesses. So Nate, what do you think? Good one?
Yeah, when I was learning about this, I had a partnership that went very, very wrong. And I mean, it literally consumed years of my life. And if you have a partnership, it's the closest thing to a marriage that you can possibly have. And anything that's going to help prevent or very objectively avoid conflicts down the road, you absolutely want to try to pursue and figure out. Me learning what I've learned about slicing pie framework, and for sure a novice in his topic here. So I'm anxious to see, as you've had more months and years for this to soak in, Brad, what you're going to say about it. And I definitely have some what ifs and gotchas that I want to bring up here during the conversation and just see how we might handle that.
Yeah. Let me start with a story. And about 3 or 4 years ago, I was talking to a founder. They had a partner, so the partnership in a business. I think they had been in business for a couple of years, and it was clear that they both wanted to be the visionary. And if you are not familiar with the traction model of visionary versus integrator, it makes it very clear. The TLDR on the book Rocket Fuel is one has to be, if you have two founders, one has to be a visionary and one has to be the integrator. That you can't do both. As Nate's pulling up he's got the book right in front of him. And so I had the conversation with him and said, if you do anything, I'm buying you 2 books and you both please go read this, because it will solve potentially some of these complaints and headaches that you're coming to me with, like asking for help on resolution. And to tie this back into the slicing pie, if most businesses, and this is probably, I don't know, 95% of the way they start, you have 2 people, okay, we'll go 50-50, split it in half. Or you have 3 people, you go a third. And we fast forward to today in this partnership. I think one of the partners decided to walk away, but they had been in business, and the business isn't great, but they're still in business and they have debts and things going on. But one of the partners is walking away and just going to do another thing. And everything, I don't even know if they had vesting or cliffs in place for the founders, which you should. But now at that point, today, this founder's walked away and he has half the business. And so if anything, if the other founder stays on and continues pushing through and makes an amazing business and results for this, that founder is going to also be rewarded from that, which is going to create a ton of resentment. So that's the takeaway. If you have not read the book Rocket Fuel, I highly recommend it. Or let's say you're a solo founder. So our VP of Ops at Elevar is David, who I've worked with for years prior to Elevar as well. And we were just talking about, hey, what do you think about the Elevar coming on and helping Elevar? And I bought the book, handed it to him and said, just read this and you would be the integrator in this role. And if that sounds exciting and amazing to you, then great. If it doesn't, no hard feelings. But that was basically a job description. It was this book. So I highly recommend it. Hey, since you have the book in front of you, I'm assuming you've read it, or is it just wall art?
It's both. Read through half of it, the main gist of implementer and the visionary, got that subject there. And I love to use all the books I've read before as wall art, because I can just look over my bookshelf there and be reminded of their subject matter. Like I just saw Dan Martell's Buy Your Time. But in any business, if you have two people who are visionaries and no one implementing all of those great creative ideas, there's going to be so much chaos with the business. We talked about this in previous episodes, the one just before about bootstrapping. Your business is going to be riddled with chaos, and there's going to be all kinds of cash flow and manpower leak. Rocket Fuel for me is great as far as creating that initial structure as you're starting to build your company out, to make sure, if you're the founder and you're a great visionary, make sure you're out there looking for that great implementer, and vice versa.
Yeah.
If you're a founder, for some reason you like to be an implementer, go out there and find someone who has a lot of experience in your particular industry and they have great vision, and you can pull them in, because that partnership, that yin and yang is going to be huge.
Yeah. Yeah. And I know I'm a terrible, maybe I'm a terrible visionary as well, but I know I'm a terrible integrator. If that was the only thing that I was responsible for, it's very different. I'm a starter. I forget what personality test those are, but 80% starter, 20% finisher. Insert joke there, which I won't, won't mention. All right, so back to slicing pie. Nate, can you just describe without getting into the very intricate nuance of what the slicing pie framework is, but just describe, if you're just chatting with somebody on the street and they're like, "Hey, Nate, what's the slicing pie framework that I've been hearing about?" How would you describe it?
Yeah, the thing that really stood out to me was this idea of dynamic equity that is targeted at creating fairness around contribution. So if that's anything I've taken from slicing pie, it's that you're trying to do everything you can to create someone being compensated based on the actual value that they've delivered to that business. So a lot of times, in our structure in Elevar and every other business I've ever done and looked into, it's all very static equity. It's based on day one. Like Brad shows up, he knows a lot more about conversion optimization and websites, e-com. He's bringing so much value. He's going to be 75% partner. Nate shows up. He knows a third of what Brad does and is making a third of what Brad was in the marketplace. So he's going to be 25% partner. And no matter what we do beyond that point, we're just locked at 75-25. Brad could leave, Nate could leave. And a lot of times it just creates this feeling one way or another of entitlement, frustration, resentment. And the slicing pie framework tries to, just create agreed upon gates and doors and escape hatches all along the way, so that each day in time, each moment in time, every person is feeling fairly compensated for the contribution they've made up until that point.
So let's define it. So compensation could be, if everyone starts at zero. So let me play this back to you. I'll pretend I know nothing about it. Okay, Nate, we're going into business. We're both at 0% equity. My hourly rate is $100 an hour, and I don't have any money to put into the business to pay for our expenses to get started. So that is a way that I would be compensated. So if we say every hour that I work is $100 an hour, and then that's tied to a piece, like a pie, so that I can earn multiple pies, and each pie would be a certain percentage of the business that I would earn over time. Is that right?
Yeah, slice within that pie.
And then, okay, so now with you, let's say you come to the table and you're like, "No, what? I'm going to put money in to pay for our expenses to keep us afloat until we start generating revenue or profit." Is that another? You use escape hatch. I forget the term you use, but that's another way that. So okay, so you put $100,000 in, so you get 10 slices of pie. Right?
Yeah. So the framework weights cash contributions higher than sweat equity, just human effort input.
Right. I remember when I first was learning about this framework, I couldn't understand the concept of, you can have, if the pie starts with 10 slices, a year from now, the pie could have 1,000 slices. And I was like, whoa, 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 whoa. The pie, the circumference is the same, right? Or not? Explain that as well, because this broke my frame when I first learned it.
Yeah. I think that, all the illustrations I saw from him, the pie, the circumference of that pie always remained the same. And it was just defining 100% of the company. So if it's worth negative $100,000 or $100 million, you're just dividing up that 100% pie in different delegations. Pie slices are just synonyms for equity percentage, but he's trying to objectively move people into conversations that's going to be centered around value and he just
Yeah.
wants to move people off of these rigid equity percentage ownership pieces.
Yeah. And it starts with defining what the fair market value would be for the business as well. Is that right?
Yeah, yeah. I think everyone gets defined pretty quickly on your cash contribution gets a fair market value, and he said that was really heavily centered around interest rates and tax rates at the time. You know, every dollar is going to have a bit of risk assigned to it if he gives it to a business, and you're trying to quantify that by the tax rates and financing rates. And then you've got
Yeah.
someone like Brad who he comes in with a certain set of skills, and the market would be willing to pay Brad X amount of $1,000 a year for his time in his particular field. And then if he's stepping in as CEO of that business, you know, that's also going to draw a different fair market value. You divide that by however many thousand hours there are in a year, and that gets you back to your hourly rate fair market value per hour of input into the business.
So it's likely sounds complex to those listening still. Like, I don't understand it. If you're listening, you probably already have a business set up. So what can someone take from, again, let's say the business right now is 50-50, two partners, and they're just learning about the slicing pie framework. Are there any steps that they can take to extract some of the learnings or methodology behind the slicing pie and implement it? Or is it too late once the business is formed?
I think if the business is formed, you're probably looking at a scenario where you would have to get all parties on board to update the operating agreement. I think this
Mhm.
is more of a thing that you learn and carry forward into future partnerships. You know, the whole thesis behind this is partnership disruptions and conflict. It's one of the worst things that can happen to you as a person and your business and your company from a financial standpoint. So let's do everything we can to avoid those conflicts. And this is what birthed the slicing pie framework. So yeah, in my personal opinion, I don't see how an existing business that's already a going concern could ever update their operating agreement and get everyone on board to be a slicing pie strategy. Do you?
Maybe, so the way I was thinking about it, the answer to this question for myself would be, let's say you have not provided equity or UARs or phantom stock options to your part of your team. Is this, you could use this framework to inform part or all of that rollout. So instead of just saying, all right, I'm going to give everyone, 1,000 shares and it's going to be equally distributed, and not take into consideration how long you've been at the company, the value you bring, what is your standard rate outside the company. Let's say they're underpaid or maybe overpaid. So I think you could take some of the guts of the slicing pie framework and put it into a stock option program for the business. So that's one.
Let me interrupt you real
The
quick.
second,
I think that's a great point. This term dynamic equity, if you are going to get into doing that for an existing company, yes, talk to your attorney about, hey, I want to introduce dynamic equity to my employees so that you feel like they're at every point in time, there's not this big vesting cliff, because there's a lot of tension around that where someone could be fired a week before they vest and they don't vest anything, or they could vest and immediately leave the next day. So having some dynamic equity function to your stock options or UARs of your employees in a current company would definitely work. That's a really good point.
Yep. You touched on the other point, which is the vesting and then a cliff. So let's go back to the partnership. If you did the 50-50 and you don't have any sort of vesting or cliff in place for the partners, then that would be an area that I would look at editing or operating agreement. Again, I'm not a lawyer, neither is Nate, although Nate's nickname is Matlock. But that would be an area that I would look to introduce. So let's say you start a business, you put a bunch of time, money into it, and 6 months, a year down the road, a shiny object pops up, one partner leaves, but there's no cliff. So they're quote unquote fully vested, since you don't have a vesting and a cliff inside the agreement. They go leave to do something else, but they retain their entire piece of the equity. And if you don't know what a cliff is, so a cliff is basically, if I'm granted 1,000 shares, I have that today, and it has a vesting period. The cliff is basically that point in time where I can start vesting. So if I might get my shares on January 1st, but my cliff date is 2 years down the road, so January 1st, 2026, then between 2024 and 26, I technically have zero options, zero stock options, zero equity, because I have not met that cliff period. Then after that, then if it's, you get 25% every year, so then 2027, I would vest 25% of my equity. 2028, I would vest the other next 25%, so I'd be at 50%, and then so on. And I was at a conversation, having a conversation with, actually, I don't think it was a customer, ecom brand owner, about 3 or 4 months ago, and there were three guys that started a business, and they were explaining part of the reason why we were meeting up. There's 3 or 4 of us. They're like, man, we are in a shitty scenario. We're trying to buy our partner out because we started this company on a golf course, and we all did a little bit in the beginning, and we just split it up by thirds. And a week or 2 weeks into it, this other partner basically walked away, just went back to his normal job, and now the business is crushing, and he's the third. He owns a third of it, and we want to buy him out. And I can tell you, in the mastermind that I'm in, with the boardroom mastermind, where pretty much everyone's over 10 million, most are over 20 million ARR, annual recurring revenue. Buyouts, like partner buyouts, man, it's crazy how common that comes up, and actually probably comes up in the smaller businesses. So when I was in the 0 to 10 million, it came up a lot. It was always partner friction. How do I buy people out? I need to get a loan to buy folks out. So anyways, I'm off on a tangent, but again, vesting and cliffs, those are 2 that you could take from the guts of the slicing pie, talk to your partner, implement it. And it's a fair conversation. If your partner's like, no, I don't want to have a cliff or a vesting schedule, maybe you need to reevaluate what's going on in the partnership.
Yeah, the buyout, I've heard of that a number of times. And the problem with the buyout that's not negotiated before the business starts or as you're forming your operating agreement is that the business is moving along and the buyout is so expensive, it creates a lot of pressure on the business where you have no margin every month. So the risk of the business really ramps up because both partners are involved in a legal dispute. You've got money going out every month from that buyout agreement forward. So that's a huge problem because now you don't have that cushion every month to be strategic and move forward. So if you can negotiate a fair market value or at least a calculation, in a couple of my most recent operating agreements, there's been baked into the situation where if one partner wants to leave, they have to make an offer to the other partner that they're willing to accept the inverse of. So, they can't come with this BS high valuation or low valuation because the other partner gets a chance to refute it and say, well, no, I'll just take that money and I'll walk away and you can run it. So a lot of times.
Is that the Mexican standoff?
It is.
Is that the Mexicans? So, all right, define the Mexican standoff provision in the operating agreement. I think it's super interesting.
Yeah, and a word for word, definitely can't call it from memory, but it's just a scenario where if Brad wants to leave our partnership, he has to come to me with an offer that he's willing to accept either side of. So he says, Nate, I want to leave. I want you to pay me, $10 million because this business is worth $50 million. And I have every right. And like Brad, once he makes that offer, he has forfeited his ability to back out. So I now have the ability to say, you know what, that's a fair offer. I'll take it. Or I can say, nope, I'm going to walk, Brad, you're going to pay me $10 million because you evaluate the business at $50 million. So those are really good clauses or sections to put into your operating agreement where you can predefine before there's so much money on the table, how you're going to fairly evaluate the business and make offers for buyouts.
I remember we talked about that years ago. It's such a good clause. The other thing, my brain's going off from that conversation I was sharing with the 3 partners, or the three friends that were trying to figure out how to buy the partner. I forgot the other guy in the conversation. He was like, you're having the same issue? I'm trying to buy my partner out. He hasn't been in the business for like 4 years, but he still owns 20% and the business is 100x. And he's like bust my balls, like, can't wait for this payout. And he's like the guy that was here at the meeting, he's like, what the hell? So he wants to sell the business because it's put so much stress on him because he feels resentment, like you mentioned before, that he is busting his ass building an amazing business. And he's like, I'm doing all this work and this guy's just sitting doing nothing and he's going to get 20% of this. So you know what? I'm out. Man, it is crazy how many stories that you probably have out there that where just partnerships get frayed and go chaotic. And there's probably some very, very bad examples. The other thing I was just thinking about is, and I've mentioned this many times to other founders after we've gone through the process, and you and I even talked about it, and like, why in business school or in coaching programs or anything that involves entrepreneurship, why isn't the first thing or first 2 things that people do, like the educator does, is like, hey, here's what a due diligence checklist looks like when you go to sell your business. Start thinking about these things now so you don't have a bunch of skeletons in your closet that could force you to not be able to sell the business. So that's number one. And then two, doing like that education on the vesting and the cliff and everything we just talked about with the partnerships. So those two to me, I think would save so much heartache, especially the due diligence checklist. So if you want one and you're listening to this, just email me, because I've had 10 people send me theirs over the years, and obviously we have ours we went through, and there are definitely, I don't know, Nate, a half dozen things that we went through them. We're like, man, I wish I knew this 5 years ago. So yeah, there's probably one more point, which is the structure, like LLC versus C corp versus S corp, which we'll get into in a minute. But yeah, those three things, I feel like a lot of education lacking in the marketplace around those.
And talking about your reasons companies fall apart, I mentioned this in another episode, but Paul Graham has a number of essays on his site, and they are really good and worth reading if you have a few minutes to just devote like 30 minutes a week to Paul Graham's website. He talks about in Y Combinator, in his experience, the main reason companies fall apart are for partnership disputes. And for a guy like that who's seen hundreds and hundreds of companies come across his desk, like that's saying something, and that is worth pausing before you start. And talking about this due diligence, there's business due diligence, and then there's person due diligence. A few things I wrote down here as far as characteristics to look for in a good business partner. One, we already talked about the complementary skill sets. So the Rocket Fuel book, back to that. You have to read that. I promise you, I've been in partnerships where both people are wanting to be the visionary and both people are not, devoting time or energy to be the implementer. And it's really tough. Previous success and failure. So Brad, that's something that stood out to me when we were starting Elevar, is that you weren't showing up with rose-colored glasses on and saying like, I've got this great idea, it's going to crush. You had a previous business that failed, and you knew early on, you said over and over again, we got to have a brand, we got to have a way to make money day one. And, you come out of those failures and successes with like a sense of humility, and you being just like humans in general. Another random thing for me I've noticed is if your partner is married and there's dual income in the household, when you're first getting started, especially in a bootstrap situation, that takes a ton of pressure off the business where, you and I, because our wives earn money, Elevar early on, there wasn't this like immediate pressure to just like pull every bit of, cash flow out of the business. We were able to, let the bank account build up a little bit. I know that sounds like a random thing.
We did? What, the bank account built up?
It wasn't getting crushed. Yeah.
2024?
All right. Let's see. The shared cash flow and sweat equity philosophy. So, we had other partners that did not share this with us. And for you and I, it was just understood, you just put in a lot of time, Brad. And because of that, that's just what happened at the business. And we didn't have to have this conversation a lot where like every hour wasn't having to be compensated with cash initially. That is going to create a ton of friction. Mm-hmm. And I think this one line item for sure on like sharing that equity philosophy is why this slicing pie framework does come in to be super relevant. Let's see, day one audience. So if, we talked about audience founders, that's a term that's coming up a lot lately. If you're able to bring skills, back to that Rocket Fuel, if you're able to bring skills to the table day one, and you can find an influencer that's going to be able to speak directly to an audience for free, that's right in your industry, that is going to be a huge shot in the arm to your business. So definitely think about that as you're starting off. And like, maybe instead of having two partners, you've got the visionary and the implementer or integrator. There might be that third person now that has that giant audience that you can pump into your business day one. Healthy personal habits. I know I'm going off here, but healthy personal habits. It's amazing how necessary it is to partner with someone who day after day, week after week, they're going to be able to stack productive minutes and hours and be able to show up every day with a clear mind and a healthy body. That sort of thing. If someone is getting sick all the time because they drink too much or they stay up late, watching shows or whatever, and they're getting 4 hours of sleep a night and they're dragging in, like over time, that is going to create a ton of resentment, because if you're showing up every day and busting your tail, over time, you're going to start resenting that person. Yeah. So those are the few that I wrote down when I was thinking about, characteristics in a business partner. You got to know someone that you're going to marry before you get to the altar. You've got to personally know someone and take some time to get to know them as a human being before you sign that operating agreement.
Yeah. Yeah, I don't really have too many additions to that. Those are all spot on. Also, having the conversation and understanding that it's a marathon. Jason Lemkin says this over and over again. It's 7 years. If you are starting a business, start the clock. 7 years before anything materially, I can't say that word, will happen. So yeah, 7 years. Just assume that that's the time you're gonna take to think about this thing 24/7, 365 without a major outcome. Now, granted, that might be a little aggressive. There, especially today with the efficiencies that you can grow and build into a business. Yeah, you might be able to distribute, take, I don't know, whatever the amount is, 6 figures, 7 figures, maybe if it's a really efficient business. But yeah, I think that's ensuring that, are you good for 7 years? All right, let's do that. I think the other communication is one that maybe didn't mention specifically, but overly communicating between the partners, and not just through text message, not just through Slacks. We know this
Yeah.
personally, Nate, how the Slack tone can just go chaos, where you might be wanting to be aggressive or not being aggressive, and the other person reads too much into it. So just being able to communicate and face to face on the phone, that is a huge advantage. Ideally in face, if you guys aren't in the same, or girls aren't in the same town.
Yeah,
But
I remember
yeah, I think that's the other
I
big one, is
remember our
communicating.
first and I think last dispute was I sent you a Slack because I love to just like get stuff out in the open, put my mind down, and I sent you the Slack.
Yeah,
And you were like, "Man, I think that's BS. Can you just come to my house and us talk this through?" So we sat down, and in that conversation, because I was able to use tone of voice and you're able to see me talking and like my facial expression and all that, like normal humans were supposed to communicate. We agreed at that point that any conversation that is going to potentially lead to friction, we need to have it at least over the phone or in person. And that helped us a ton throughout our
yeah.
partnership because I think inherently.
What was that
Oh
about?
man, we
What
we were
was
just
that?
talking. I mean, of course, it was related to debt and like the pressure that debt was creating in our partnership. I've told my wife before that
Yeah,
people can be best friends, and Brad, you and I are pretty close, and business is going to
yeah,
inherently force you into conflict because like we've got to talk through these things that do we want to
yeah.
file our taxes right now? Do we want to file an extension? Do we want to fire this person? Like those things
Yeah,
are inherently going to breed conflict. If you don't have the operating agreement that's structured to help address that conflict or create these communication approaches that are going to allow you guys to peacefully discuss things, aka never do it over Slack or text.
yeah,
It's just going to
yeah,
like feed that friction in your partnership. And if you're in friction with somebody, your brain is not working creatively on the business, and then you aren't working collaboratively with your partner to drive the business forward.
yeah. Yeah, I use voice memos
Oh
now a
man,
lot more in Slack, even when it's not something that's confrontational. It's just voice. Just send an audio message, which helps.
100%. I do that all the time.
So let's go. Let's close the loop on the slicing pie framework. We've talked a lot about the benefits of it. So what are the cons? Because there are some cons that we both will be able to come up with, and you might be thinking about listening to this. But yeah, let's go through the cons from your perspective, Nate, on the
Okay,
slicing
yeah,
pie
I
framework.
would start. Let's start within the pie, so within your company, and then we'll work outward to third parties. So for me, defining fair market value, I could see that as being a major problem because you've got someone coming in that says, I could definitely get paid this much. And sometimes that amount is very subjective, or they're looking at comps for their job description in different areas of the company or country where the compensation is going to be higher just, because to turn the lights on in San Francisco, you got to get paid 30 to 50% more than you do in North Carolina, South Carolina. So I think everyone
Yeah,
agreeing objectively on a fair market value model for cash coming in or sweat equity, that would be the big hurdle for me initially, because that's going to set up, the entire model to work well or work poorly.
yeah. Yeah, I would agree. That would likely be, and maybe I'll even say the con of this, just trying to go through this framework is going to be contentious.
Yeah.
So that is a con versus just split it up, make it equal. I think another con to this with the sweat equity versus the putting money in is tracking that sweat equity. If you're in the early stages of the business, you're always thinking about it. There still isn't a time where I'm never not thinking about business. how do you quantify that? If I go for a walk for 2 hours, I'm thinking about this problem. So I think that's also another challenge or a con of this framework of how do you put that
Yeah.
into a
Yeah.
box?
And if you're a visionary, your job, if Brad is the one hammering out the email sequence for Elevar and he loses 2 days producing that instead of thinking, okay, what do we need to be doing 30 to 90 days from now? Like you've actually made the business worse. But if you're a visionary, like what do you do?
Hmm.
Upload a photo of your brain. So I think that's very difficult. I think the tracking hours, you know, people who are working and who are creative and like the producers also, when you get into a workflow, you can contribute 10 hours of value in 2 hours of real time work. So how do you
Yeah.
quantify that? Is someone manipulating it? I think it still is going to be dependent upon, do you trust this person and are they being fair? And again, so far with the slicing pie framework, I see the fair market value and the tracking of contribution as like the two things that the entire model hinges upon, and it comes back to a human being honest and objective for those entries.
Yeah. We might sound like we're all rosy today, but I recall going back to the early days when we were transferring money from our personal Wells Fargo accounts into Elevar Wells Fargo account, and those were in the spreadsheet that we had to track because there was one other person on the cap table that was from a debt transition. And I recall one time, like I was, whatever the number was that was down for me, I was like, whoa, 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 that's way more than that. What about the 700
Mm-hmm.
hours that I put in that's not tracked in here? I don't want my like how to quantify my value of the company is just based on whatever dollar amount I moved into it. So again, these early, especially in the early days, there's just no way around it. These conversations are hard, and you were going to have some anxiety or resentment
Yeah.
that pops up. But it's a necessary evil to get through today. Have the hard conversation today, so you can have the easy conversations for the
Yeah, and
rest
if
of the
you can't be
business.
brutally honest with this person you're about to get into business with, you should not continue to move forward. So it is a great litmus test early on to understand, like, how fair is this person? Are they willing to hear your thoughts and potentially change their perspectives? But it's definitely naive to think that let's just do 50-50 because we're not going to have a dispute, because you're 100% going to have a dispute.
We'll worry about it when we get
Yeah.
bigger, when it becomes a real business. That's the air
Yeah, and
quotes.
so
I
what
love it.
you were just speaking to there was the other major objection I have with this whole model is, I mean, it's just a fact, like you contributed more value to Elevar than I did. So how do we address that elephant in the room, and how are you going to get an investor who's working off of 50 years of knowledge or whatever, of, okay, I come in and I put in $100,000 into your business. At that point in time, I'm going to get equity exchange for that. And why would they sign up day one into a sliding scale of, okay, well, as the business grows in value, I'm taking a huge risk right now with real cash, not, perceived sweat equity. This is real cash that's going to show up on a bank balance, on my tax returns. Why would I say I'm taking the ultimate risk right now and I'm going to agree to that $100,000 or that 15% equity that's buying just gradually diminishing over time as the business grows value? Like, how do you get an investor who's going to agree to that kind of paradigm shift? That would be a huge problem for me. Yeah.
Yeah, they wouldn't. Yeah,
Right.
they wouldn't. All right, well let's wrap this one up. So a couple key takeaways. We'll put these links in the show notes. So one, if you are not familiar with this framework, we'll have a link to a YouTube video so you can watch it. I think we also you have an article from an attorney who's used this approach over
Yep.
1,000 times, so he might have a little bit of experience in here. The book Traction, sorry, not Traction, Rocket Fuel, same author as Traction, but Rocket Fuel, great book on that visionary versus integrator partnership. And yeah, just don't set it aside, and talk about your vesting and cliff schedules with your partner
Yep.
or your team.
Yeah.
Anything else? Anything else to wrap
Yeah.
up
For
this
for
one,
me,
Bo?
this might be a topic that's a bit nuanced, but in my experience, there's nothing more stressful than partnership conflicts. So do everything you can before you start your business and you sign that operating agreement to create an approach that is going to be objective. This dynamic equity piece, you may not implement the slicing pie framework in totality, But the dynamic equity piece is something you should for sure consider and discuss with your attorney so that everything is going to be fair. And I love the idea of everyone getting compensated based on the value they've actually contributed to the business, not what they brought in, not what they can do down the road, but what they've actually done to move the needle for this current company.
There we have it.
All right.
I can't take no loss. I don't even know what it costs.